In our family, there was no clear line between religion and fishing. We lived at the junction of great trout rivers in western Montana. Our father was a Presbyterian minister and a fly fisherman who tied his own flies and taught others. He told us about Christ's disciples being fishermen, and we were left to assume, as my brother and I did, that all first-class fishermen on the Sea of Galilee were fly fishermen, and that John, the favorite, was a dry fly fisherman. Those words are probably familiar to those of you who have read Norman McLean or seen the movie A River Runs Through It. What is it about fishing and sharing the good news that the kingdom of God is at hand? I had reached midlife before I became acquainted with the sublime pleasures of wading in moving water and presenting a fly on the lovely streams of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Growing up in southwestern Ohio, I was introduced to fishing by our next-door neighbor, Mr. Robards. Mr. Robards was a veteran of the First World War. He always called it my World War. And he was a retired bricklayer. He and his wife, Minnie, had one child, a son, who was killed in the Second World War. I don't think the bitterness about losing his only son ever left him. But he seemed to find happiness in gardening and fishing. And when I was about 10 years old, my brother would have been 7. Mr. Robards started bringing us along when he went fishing on Saturday mornings. Perhaps we reminded him of his own boy. He usually touched base with our parents in the middle of the week, which meant that Doug and I had several days to get excited about all the fun we were going to have on Saturday morning. Sometimes we leafed through the pages of Boy's Life or scanned the magazine rack at Tom's First Ward cigar store, admiring pictures of bluegill, perch, catfish, small and largemouth bass. On Friday nights, we had trouble going to sleep just thinking about all the fish we were going to catch. When morning finally came, we would meet Mr. Robards in his front yard. I would bring an old bait casting rod and reel that my dad used when he was a kid. And Mr. Robards loaded 3 more rigs into the back of his station wagon. He fished with 2 of them, and the third, which had a foolproof Zebco spin cast reel, was for my little brother. Acton Lake, which was created by damming 4 Mile Creek, was only 15 miles from our home. But Doug and I were so excited that it was impossible to sit still for a car ride that seemed to last for hours. When we finally reached the lake, we would grab our tackle and run to the water's edge as fast as we could. Mr. Robards would take his time, setting up a wooden stool, pouring coffee from a plaid thermos, and carefully baiting 4 hooks. The worms were from a compost heap in his backyard. Doug and I would cast our lines and would manage to throw them out a few yards, and expected our red and white bobbers to start being pulled under at any moment. And then we started getting antsy. It wasn't until Linda and I had children of our own that I fully appreciated how difficult it is for a child of 10 to sit still on the edge of a lake, or for a 9-inning baseball game, or a 1-hour worship service. After my line had been in the water for a few moments, I started to wonder whether a fish had stolen my bait, so I'd pull it out, look at the hook, and throw it back in. Sometimes a boat would go past and the wake would make ripples on the surface of the water, and the movement of my bobber would convince me that I had a bite. So I'd pull my line out, and then I'd throw it back. All of this thrashing around may explain why Mr. Robards was content to fish at some distance from my brother and me. Come to think of it, no one else seemed interested in joining us either. It might have been more efficient for him to stay a little closer because I never really got the hang of setting the tension on my bait casting reel. About every third time I made a cast, I ended up with a backlash. And of course it fell to Mr. Robards to help straighten out the tangled mess that I created. For a moment, I might be mesmerized by the reflection of the sun on the surface of the water. But then I would try to figure out what was going on the other side of the lake. Or I'd start to pick at the grass or study the movement of the ants across the surface of the rocks or among the blades of grass. Sometimes I'd construct a small shelter for them with twigs or pick up rocks to look underneath for roll-up bugs. Soon enough, I started to wonder when we were going to go home. What I don't recall is catching any fish. That Mr. Robards would invite us to go with him the following weekend, and the weekend after that, and that between each trip, my brother and I would look forward to the next, says a great deal about the triumph of hope over experience. Our theme these next few weeks is between. We're situated between the season of Christmas and the season of Lent. But we also find ourselves between the inauguration of the kingdom of God. In this morning's gospel reading, Jesus announced, "Now is the time." We're situated between the inauguration of the kingdom of God and its fulfillment. God's kingdom has indeed broken into our world in the birth, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But in our reading from 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul wrote that the time had drawn short, that the world in its present form was passing away. Paul expected that Christ would return in the lifetime of his readers. 2,000 years later, here we are. And a glimpse at the headlines or the images on our television screens is more than enough to remind us that the kingdom of God has not been fulfilled. Fishing on Acton Lake was a between experience. Like the children of Israel who were waiting for a Messiah, all I could think about all week was how much fun my brother and I were going to have fishing with our next door neighbor. But when the day finally came, I became impatient and frustrated that I wasn't catching any fish. Maybe you're frustrated this morning. Maybe you're wondering whether creation is really moving toward the fulfillment of God's kingdom. Maybe your prayers echo the words of the psalmist who cried out, "How long, O Lord? How long?" Like the Apostle Paul, many of us groan inwardly. Indeed, Paul wrote that the whole creation groans as in the pains of childbirth as we await the fulfillment of the reign of God. It's hard to be patient as we live in such troubling times. In our impatience, it might be helpful to think of the triumph of the resurrection. The fulfillment of the kingdom of God is working its way through the cosmos the way ripples move out along the surface of the water. But I think God expects us to do more than sit on a bank and wait for the blessed hope. In this morning's gospel reading, after Jesus announced that the kingdom of God is at hand, he told his fishermen, Simon and Andrew, that he would show them how to fish for people. That's a very rich metaphor. It may have been inspired by several passages in the Hebrew Scriptures. Jesus and Simon and Andrew and James and John would have been familiar with the words of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Amos. In Jeremiah, the prophet says that God will send a great number of fishermen to bring the unfaithful to judgment. Ezekiel depicts Pharaoh as a giant crocodile of the Nile and says that God will put hooks in his mouth. Amos writes that God will use fish hooks to carry away those who oppress the poor. But Jesus turned these images upside down. When he invited Simon and Andrew to fish for people, it wasn't to bring people to judgment. It was to join in a ministry of healing. It was to join in a ministry of setting things right. It was to join in proclaiming that the time had come. It was to join in proclaiming that God's kingdom is near, that people should change their lives and trust the good news. Jesus invited them to fish for people by proclaiming the good news, to proclaim good news to the poor, freedom for prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind. By offering food and drink to the hungry and thirsty, offering hospitality to the stranger, offering clothing to those in need, and visiting the poor, visiting the sick, visiting those in prison. By breaking down barriers of gender, status, and ethnicity. By welcoming the prodigal with open arms. I heard a lot of fishing stories in Tom's First Ward cigar store when I was a kid. No doubt some of them were true. But I also learned early in life that sometimes the facts just don't take you where you're trying to go. Maybe you've heard this story before. In fact, maybe you've heard me tell it before. But I remember a story about an old fella called Emerson Skinner, who always caught his limit, even when no one else was catching any fish. Well, the game warden became suspicious, so one Saturday he told Emerson that he was going to join him on the lake. They rowed out on a john boat, and when they found a spot that looked promising, Emerson lit the fuse of a stick of dynamite and tossed it out onto the water. Well, after the explosion, as the fish started floating to the surface of the water, Emerson grabbed the net and started scooping them up. The game warden was horrified. And he said to him, "Emerson, you know that dynamiting fish is illegal." Emerson didn't say a word. He just grabbed another stick of dynamite, lit the fuse, handed it to the warden, and finally said, "Are you here to talk or to fish?" Maybe you've heard that story before. But this between time is also a time of alternative facts. And it hardly seems like the time to stop lying about fishing. Living in a time between the season of Christmas and the season of Lent, living in a time between the inauguration and the fulfillment of the kingdom of God, we too have a choice. Are we going to talk or are we going to fish? Are we going to be paralyzed by our frustration, overwhelmed by our understandable anxiety, defeated by the heartache of a broken world, or are we going to join Jesus in fishing for people, proclaiming the good news of the inbreaking of God's kingdom in the person of Jesus Christ, following his example by breaking down barriers of gender, status, and ethnicity, proclaiming good news to the poor, freedom for prisoners, and recovery of sight to the blind, offering food and drink to the hungry and thirsty, offering hospitality to the stranger, offering clothes to those in need, and visiting those who are sick or in prison. Our mission field lies just outside these walls. Are we going to talk or are we going to fish?